Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in a series of talks we're doing around repowering. Repowering has become a topic in the UK, particularly hot at the moment, because if we're going to try and achieve our net zero targets, everyone's realising that there's a lot of existing renewables projects in the early waves, whether they are going to be onshore wind, most likely to start with, but in due course solar, that are going to need to be repowered. Either that or that generation is going to come off the grid, and we're going to have to build even more to make up for it. So repowering is going to become an increasingly big issue for the UK. I'm joined today from colleagues in Edinburgh, Ross and Mark. Thank you very much for joining us. I guess the first question I'd ask in this is, when we talk about repowering, everyone presumably thinks it's a lot easier because you've got an existing site and you're going to be putting up a new site, if that's your definition of repowering on that. But what are some of the things you need to consider? I mean, is it easier to use an existing site, or does it cause complications in your world of construction and procurement?
Well, hi, Ross. I think it's a good question, and I think, repowering is an exciting area of our industry. You can see why developers are very keen to get involved. The first sort of generation of projects is perhaps coming to an end. There's been all kinds of technological advances that they're keen to take advantage of. That can be more capacity, better efficiency of their project, and that can be a larger revenue stream. So, the attractions are definitely there, but before you jump 2 feet in, there are a number of considerations that you have to keep in mind as a developer or as someone keen on embarking on repowering. I mean, put simply, you might want to think at the beginning as to, well, whose permission do I need to do this? It may be that they are few and far between, but typically we find that, well, who owns the site is a good place to start. Is there a landowner that you have to get permission on before they are alarmed by all kinds of activity on the site? Similarly, depending on how long the project's been going, there may still be a debt interest on the site and a funder who will almost always require you to give their permission before you embark on a sort of repowering of any sort of scale. And then what sort of existing contracts are in place? Are there connection agreements? Are there existing O&M agreements? And perhaps there might even be other contractors still on site. So you really have to sort of consider all of those things before you embark on, as I say, what can be a really exciting project.
Thanks very much. And I guess, Ross, picking up on the construction side, I guess if you've got an existing site and you're going to repower it, it may or may not be the same developer doing that. It might be a new developer who's done a deal with the landowner who's coming on site. So from a construction perspective, you're dealing with not just a construction of a new facility, but I suppose demolition, decommissioning of the existing one. And does that lead to complications?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Ross. It may be the same developer, but it equally wouldn't necessarily be the same developer. And you might find that there's a market opening up for repowering developers who specialize just in that as it stands. And obviously there's a handover and an interface risk in that situation where you're trying to figure out what's happened in the previous commissioning and building project in comparison to the renewable one, to the repowering one. Sorry. So you've got that consideration, and then I think the main thing that you would want to be thinking about in terms of boots on the ground is there's obviously an O&M project in place at the time. So. Yeah. How will repowering impact your existing project? Is there going to be an outage time? All of those things that you want to be thinking about from an operational perspective, along with quite a lot of sort of legal points that I'm sure we'll come on to in a minute.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because in other areas, land, maybe consenting and so forth, you can see that it may be a bit more easy to do it in a sequential basis. When it comes to construction and engineering, the reality is you are going to have to be probably dealing with and interacting with the existing project in one way, shape or form, and you're dependent on what happens and when the existing project is decommissioned before you can build your new one, even if you've got consent for that. So probably a little bit. Is it fair to say we would say it's a bit more complicated than if you were just building a project on a new site, whether greenfield or brownfield?
Well, I think there's pros and cons, really. I mean, as you said at the beginning, Ross, there may be a certain degree of familiarity with the site, the community's used to it, so you don't have to perhaps do that initial sort of DD of the project that you might have to when you were starting with a fresh piece of paper. But of course, an operational asset, perhaps the whole purpose of the repowering is perhaps predicated on the fact that you think it can do better. So you're removing things, you're plugging in new technologies. When you think of, for example, in the wind turbine space, the new generation of wind turbines are far greater in some respects than the initial ones that were put in place maybe 20 years ago. So even the type of technology, the type of kit being fitted will cause its own opportunities, but also potentially its own problems.
I mean, to add to that point, we've seen it where the turbines being replaced are much bigger, so you need less in one particular site. So that changes the layout of the project. And then co-location, we've seen batteries also located on the same thing. That's a new revenue stream. But if they weren't co-located before, then that brings its own challenges and things that, to answer your original question, you wouldn't have had to think about if you're doing a brand new project. But that's the kinds of things that when you're repowering, not all repowering projects are the same, and you have to really think about it in their own context.
Okay. I'd like to bring you both on, if I may, to where we are at the moment, because when these original projects were built, the ones that are coming to the end of their life, they were pioneer projects. They were out there. The supply chain was one thing, but it's moved on now. Wind is a proven technology. Onshore wind projects are being built all around the globe. In terms of where we are with the renewable supply chain, 20, 25 years on from those first projects, that things have moved on. They seem to have tightened and hardened. Is that fair?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, the growth of the industry, the renewables industry in the UK over the last 2 decades has, been unprecedented. There's so many opportunities. There are more operators, more balance of plant contractors, and so on. So you might think, that the industry is built, the capacity is there, and I just need to choose my contractor. But what we're seeing is that, we attended a hydrogen conference recently, for example. That's a whole new area of work that's coming on stream. There's ambitious projects in that space coming up, let alone, the latest generations of battery and wind and so on. So it's a very busy space, and we're finding that, balance of plant contractors and other key stakeholders, their slates are being filled up, not least because the initial projects are being decommissioned now. But I mean, there is an advantage in that there is a certain predictability about some of that, So almost a piece of advice is, when you're planning your initial project, once the contract's signed, and as much as everyone sometimes wants to put it in a drawer, that should be the key for you to start considering, okay, this is a 25-year project. I may want to repower this further down the line. Can I make any arrangements now that would make that easier?
Yeah. Okay. I suppose if you were planning one of these projects, a repowering project, what would be your top tips on supply chain contracting?
Well, that's a great question. I think almost actually the same advice would go for new projects in itself, which is early engagement with the supply chain. It's really, really important that you don't get any nasty surprises. You have a clear vision in mind as to what your repowering will entail, and you probably have a lot of options when it comes to repowering. It's not just one solution to repowering. So engage those technical advisors early, and then as a spin-off of that, understand that supply chain that would be involved in making that repowering, and engage them early. In fact, as Mark said, really, have your completion party, but after that, do think about some repowering sort of halfway through that lifespan.
And how do you make your project attractive to the supply chain?
Well, I think in the course of the negotiations, it'll come out, no doubt some of the issues you'll have to wrestle with is, you can have a partial repowering. It needn't be a 100% takedown. And if there is a partial repowering, you're thinking about things like, if I'm using a different contractor than I was, will they wrap previous work by the other contractor? And, if it's a relatively modest piece of work, the new contractor may, not want to sign up to a liability cap of anything like the quantum of the initial work or the size of the overall project. Now, these are part of the to and fro of commercial negotiation, but I think if you've thought about that in the first instance and take those issues to the table and be ready to speak in a sort of empathetic way with the contractor from the get-go and show you understand those, you know, you'll be sort of marked out as a developer that is worth working with, I think, and hopefully your project will be attractive to the various contractors that are out there as a result.
Excellent.
Well, also, I think I would add to that, Ross, as well. If there is external funding, it's not necessarily always externally funded. You've got balance sheet funding, but if you have that dialogue with that funder early, what you're avoiding is a situation where you're almost having to negotiate on both fronts. If you speak to your funders, understand, you know, what it is that the funder wants out of the project, and then you're able to sort of filter that through into the contractual packages early, you're not having to go back and forth between the parties to figure out what's okay for the funder, what's okay for a subcontractor, and hopefully you're not left with the balance of the risk. So that's also something that we try and address quite early on. Sounds
like another top tip. So thanks for that. Listen, I'd like to thank you both for participating in this. It's really, really useful. If you'd like to find out more about this particular area, then please feel free to contact Ross, Mark, or myself via our website. These will also go up on our website, and you can go to our YouTube channel as well to see this and our whole series on repowering. So thanks once again, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ross.